Charlie, I want to talk about Catholic social teaching and emphasize the global character of it, often described in terms of solidarity, the solidarity of all of the family of nations around our globe. And before we get specific about the peace and war questions that involves and the questions of development, I want to bring out the developmental character of Catholic social teaching. We often date it back to 1891 with Rerum Novarum, the Condition of Labor, issued by Pope Leo XIII, and ever since, the Catholic Church has been trying in various ways to meet the changing world scene. And therefore, the Catholic social teaching is not like a set body of 10 ideas or strict rules that one can follow to make the world more just and peaceful, but it is an evolving effort to apply the gospel of Jesus Christ to the new scene. And it is an effort to say, what does the Christian message have to say as world conditions change? And so one of the clear developments we see in Catholic social teaching is that it's become more international. It's become more global in its perspective. A lot of people date that back to 1961 with Pope John the 23rd, his Mater et Magistra, which drew the ire of many conservatives when he wrote that. And then his 1963, right before he died, he wrote another famous encyclical, probably the most famous of all the Catholic encyclicals, I suppose, Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, which got a great play in the secular world, was discussed by people at the University of Chicago, the United Nations, and really made a difference in the way people thought about global politics, I think, and economic matters. So there is a changing scene, and each new encyclical has to take up the different questions. So let's just talk about that dynamic for a minute here of the change that goes on.
Well, Jim, I think it's a dynamic that reflects out over the last 100 years, especially the last 30 or 40 years, just given the fact that the international, social, and economic unity of things has just changed dramatically in the period, especially, let's say, since World War II. The Church, interestingly enough, speaks to those issues as, to the best that I can recognize, the only major institution in the world that has an institutional presence literally worldwide. From a corporate point of view, if you had distributorships and local management units as widely spread out as the Catholic Church does, you would have market penetration to an unbelievable degree. And so the Church, in a sense, especially if you see the Church not simply as the Holy Father in Rome, but even as symbolically represented by the thousands of bishops at the Vatican Council, or this representative group that gathers in the Synod of Bishops every 3 years, if you see the Church speaking to these issues as an institution which is globally linked, which is in contact with people at the grassroots in literally every culture and every nation on the face of the world, then the possibility that the Church may be able to speak to those issues which some insight which other institutions don't have becomes a definite asset that I think the Church brings to a dialogue with government, with other social groupings, and with a global community ultimately.
I think that's very true, and therefore the leaders of the Church do have a certain broad perspective. I think that's why Pope John Paul II, for example, has issued encyclical which ends up critiquing both capitalism and socialism, and in pointing out that the great problems in the East-West relationship. So that he himself has has tried to point out that we have to find ways to criticize these systems so that we can live in greater harmony in our world. That encyclical is in its Latin title is Solicitudo Rei Socialis. That's 1988. It's often translated the social concerns of the Church, since it's one of the Latin phrases that's harder to say than Rerum Novarum. We've gotten used to saying that one, and we often stick with it. But this one on social concerns of the Church, 1988, the Pope said that when you look at the world, the problem is you've got the East-West bloc, you've got the Cold War between the Western world and the Soviet Union, United States and Soviet Union, two superpowers. They're spending a lot of money on armaments. They're shipping armaments around, and as a result, the North-South problems are not attended to. The Southern nations on this globe, underdeveloped by and large, or in a developing status, are not attended to, and therefore that what we've got to do is change the arms race, change this confrontational situation between the Soviet Union and the United States, so we can do something about bringing the rest of the world on board economic development. Well, that's an example. Now, as soon as I say that, you can see he wrote that in 1988, and now we're looking at the world in 1991, and we say the Pope's analysis is out of date already within 3 years.
What East-West arms race?
Yeah,
yes.
right. And look at the Soviet Union and the United States cooperating on the Persian Gulf situation, for example, and the rapprochement between the two countries. So this highlights the need for Catholic social teaching to keep adapting itself to the new scene. In fact, on May 15th of 1991, the Pope is supposed to issue an encyclical, a new encyclical, commemorating Rerum Novarum 1891, and its publication date was May 15th. Whether this will actually happen or not, I don't know, but the Pope will have to, I think, address the new situation and say how are we going to deal with questions of peace and war now, where the great problem might be regional conflicts and Persian Gulf type situations, and not the gigantic conflict between the superpowers.
And yet a consistent point that I think has been there, Jim, even though, as you say, the 88 encyclical seems terribly out of date already in terms of its focus on the East-West issue. But for at least the last 30 years, certainly both reflected by the input at the Vatican Council from bishops from all over the world, the consistent pattern and the growing pattern of the gap between, however you want to call, rich and poor nations, developed, underdeveloped nations, north-south in some cases, the whole Brandt Commission study, the sense that the Church is terribly conscious of living in a world in which there is a tremendous discrepancy between the top of the heap and the bottom of the heap in terms of access to basic human needs, concerns of food, clothing, shelter, health care, education, those alone. The access to those for 40, 50, 60% of the world's population, and the access to those in the Soviet Union or the United States or the developed industrialized nations, there is such a discrepancy, but there's been a consistent, for at least the last 30 years, major theme in Catholic social teaching that says that's got to be addressed because it is one family. And the reality that by nation, by culture, by geography, we are very spread out in a sense, does not override what from the Church's perspective is a fundamental truth, that there is a human family, and the commonness of that is more significant than the cultural and social and geographical divisions.
And as you point out, that's a great continuity
Strong
that we find
continuity.
even in most recent Catholic social thought. We can go back to Pacem in Terris, which was written by John the 23rd in 1963, and see one way he tried to spell that out was in terms of human rights. And he talked about all kind of rights, the social, civil rights that we're familiar with in this United States of ours, a right to free speech, for example. But he also pointed out economic rights, something that has been dearer to the heart of socialist countries in the past, although one wonders how well they carried them out, but at least in principle or theory, they said there was to be economic rights. And the Pope lists all of those, things like rights to a job.
The right to earn a living.
Yes, rights to have health care. And so on. So what the Pope did when he looked at this larger situation, said if we look at the whole human family, the global situation, we have to say that all these people in various countries around the world have one thing going. They have dignity and worth, and because they're made in the image of God from our religious perspective, therefore they have rights, economic, social, civil rights that must be respected. And we have to set up structures, governmental structures, and so on, to make sure that these rights really are fundamentally respected.
I think the connecting point, too, to another of the major themes that's been there in Catholic social teaching has been, from even the initial balance in Rerum Novarum, of the strong emphasis on the right of private ownership, but at the same time clearly enunciating the social responsibility of the use of material goods. I think the increasing emergence of a sense that says that the resources of the planet, the food resources, the resources in the sense of the collective resource that human knowledge and human potential and technology are fundamentally there not for the private benefit of whoever happens to have his or her hands on it at the moment, but for the well-being. That if the planet has the capacity to feed the citizens of the planet, that's a fundamental issue. It's hard for us, I think, still to look at. We tend very naturally and spontaneously to look at life in terms of from very localized to, at best, from national perspectives. If Americans are starving, Americans are concerned. If the people of Poland or the people of Bangladesh or the people of the Soviet Union are starving, doesn't bother us as much. The Church is saying that should bother us because that's family, whether we are able to be comfortable with that concept or not.
I think that's very true. And it also brings up one of the great dangers that the Catholic social teaching has tried to counteract, and that is nationalism. The Church has seen the need for some way to temper that. It's not figured out how to do that. But one of the themes that we find in it, in the Catholic social teaching, is the importance of the United Nations, for example. That the United Nations represent one possible way of controlling nationalism. In fact, the popes have suggested that we need to move to a place where there would be an overarching political entity which could control the behavior of various nations when they were out of line and were hurting the good of the whole human family. Now that's something, a very avant-garde notion and a radical notion that most people in the United States don't even want to hear. In fact, if you want to get a hearing for Catholic social teaching, don't start with that point, because we don't want to hear it. I mean, we don't want anybody, any world court or any larger body telling us what to do in this country. But if you look at what happens in the world, all the wars we've had, the difficulties, what a tremendous role nationalism plays. Just go back, Second World War, Nazism and so on, for one clear example. But you see it at work constantly. So the Church is saying that, yes, there's this global perspective, one human family, therefore you're going to need political and economic structures which are going to control the deviant behavior of individual nations.
You at least need a referee.
Yeah.
I find it ironic, though, that we Americans are not able to connect back into what from our own historical experience says is possible. There was a period in our own country, and you don't have to go back terribly far, when it would have not been unheard of for the citizens of Massachusetts to literally violently go to war against the citizens of Connecticut because of tax issues or border issues or something like that. Now, if today, regardless of the issue, if the governor of the state of Michigan truly, sincerely wanted to call out the Michigan National Guard and violently go to war with the Ohio National Guard over a border dispute, we would all find it the most rational thing in the world to have the federal government step in and say, wait a minute, hold it, we can't have this. And it would be taken for granted that something like that would need to happen. We aren't at all comfortable with extrapolating that and moving it out one level, that our historical comfortableness and just familiarity with the idea that nation goes to war against nation and that's just the way it is, to move from that to a sense that that's just as illogical to allow one state in the United States to violently take up arms against a neighboring state regardless of the issue.
We could call our new order then a world federalism, because our federal system here, we found a solution to the antipathy between various states. We found a way of having an overarching system, and there's still state government, there's still local educational efforts, a principle of subsidiarity played up by Catholic social thought still is at work in our country to a large degree. We associate for everything, and it generally works. And as you say, it would be a matter of extrapolating that to one step further to encompass the world community. Charlie, I want to look at another aspect of Catholic global social teaching, and that was enunciated in a strong measure by Pope Paul VI, who kept saying, if you want peace, you must work for justice. If you want peace, you must work for justice in the world community. And what that suggested is that the wealthy nations, the developed nations, had responsibilities to the poorer nations in the world. And then that suggested that there be ways of adjusting the trade system, that there be proper ways of helping those countries to develop. So that for Pope Paul VI, one of his key phrases was not only that if you want peace, work for justice, but that is the new word for peace in the modern world is, he said, development. So that the way that you solve world problems is by enabling countries to to take hold, to improve their own economies, to find their ways, to enable their citizens to improve themselves economically. That this is where we're supposed to. This is where the action is. Development is the key to peace in the world.
And that inherently means an interaction between nations. No nation in the world, even the Soviet Union or the United States, is totally self-sufficient for its own major needs and concerns. In some nations of the world, there's a dramatic need to import 80 to 90% of essentials from the outside, and you have a nation whose entire economy is focused on one commodity or one product. So that to talk about developing a healthy economy that is stable, that is peaceful, that is not constantly being disrupted by internal violence, where the basic human needs of food, clothing, shelter, education, medical care are being adequately met, is naturally going to call for an inter-cooperative relationship between nations. If there are no, in effect, ground rules for that interplay, other than how can those who have make as much profit as possible from those who need, you are inherently going to perpetuate a sense of conflict. And we have to, it seems to me, at least be about exploring, are there more cooperative ways to do that that protect the legitimate well-being and interests of all the players in the game?
That is the ideal, certainly. The social encyclicals in the Catholic Church often spawn debate then among various political parties and commentators and so on. And one of the elements that ends up being debated in the light of your comments there is what is often called the theory of dependency. The liberation theologians in Latin America played that up in large measure. And their fundamental point was that the Latin American countries were economically dependent upon the United States, and because they are dependent upon the United States, that they will never make it economically, that they will always be in an inferior position, that we will take their raw materials, sort of pay what we want for them, and then we'll produce products for our own people, and they will be left out. And then part of the argument is, well, then that puts them in the business of creating raw materials for us, and they don't grow their own food, they don't take care of their own needs, and therefore you have excessive amounts of poor people in those countries. Then we have, from the conservative side, neoconservatives especially, saying, no, the theory of dependency doesn't wash, because if you look around the world, you got countries like Japan, who are in great trading relationship with the United States, and they have limited resources and so on, and yet they are economically prosperous. So don't mean to adjudicate this particular argument, but just to point out that Catholic social teaching often spawns a whole other set of ideas and a body of literature that ends up debating what the overall teaching means. So we're saying there's got to be cooperation. Some in the United States would say, well, Latin America was best off if they continue to trade with us, and that's the way they will develop, and so on. Others would say that we're the cause of their problems.
I think it loops back into two issues that we touched on earlier. One is an issue of self-determination. The other is the issue of just the fundamental question of human dignity. I would not attempt to say that all dependency relationships are bad. If the dependency relationships are meeting legitimate needs of both partners, to keep it simple, to a two-sided relationship, and both feel good about it, you have something I need, I have something you need, we can meet one another's needs, and in some way we continue to remain dependent on each other, fine. When I have a sense, or you have a sense, that you are being manipulated and abused, even though needs may be met on an economic or commodity level or something like that, if the end product is for you as an individual or you collectively as a people, a country, to be angry, to be hostile, that inherently is going to create long-term and in a lot of cases short-term problems that you cannot perpetuate a system like that simply because somebody's gaining from it. The cows will come home at some point.
Yes, indeed. I think you bring up, wider issues of perception in the world, and a lot of, the idea that United States policy ought to, as we saw in the Carter administration, for example, great stress on human rights, and some people wanted to make fun of that or talk about it in terms of weakness and play it off against military power and so on. But it seems to me that in any talk about proper foreign policy, proper relationship to other countries, human rights ought to play an important role, and that we ought to find ways to support governments that are more democratic, that want to help people to move forward, who are interested in economic reform. It might mean policies in which we're willing to forgive international debt, for example, so that countries can get started, as we've done with Poland. In other words, there's a lot of ways we can play a constructive role, and it seems to me that it ought to have some sense of, as you put it, how do you better the human community? How do you make the situation more equitable among the whole human race?
I think an issue that comes up too, and while it's certainly not the whole picture, there are certainly some cases that where the United States, as a matter of public policy, is supportive of governments that are extremely repressive in terms of human rights, because on the local scene that is perceived as protecting the kind of safe economic climate that allows corporations with which the United States has a major financial interest to flourish. Short term, in short perspective, that may be good. Allows company X to operate in country Y and do so profitably, and everybody seems to be gaining, except the hostility, the resentment that blows up, and that will continue to blow up in everything from energy and petroleum related situations to other third world situations where there is a major industrial dependency on certain commodities and raw materials, and that in order to protect a safe market and production for those, that there's repression of local civil rights. Certainly some of the history of the United States involvement with the Allende regime in Chile is one example that comes to mind, although there are certainly more contemporary ones. We have to realize that as the peoples of the world become increasingly connected in terms of communications media, in terms of awareness of what's going on, fewer and fewer people are willing to simply ignore or allow that to happen than may have been the case 20, let alone 50 or 100 years ago.
Indeed, I think that is true. The interdependence theme is really important in all this. We see that the well-being of one affects the others. I mean, I think we've seen that in terms of the Marshall Plan in our own history and rebuilding Germany and Japan after Second World War. What happened? They became our great trading partners and have helped our economy to flourish. It's an example of interdependence. Some have said that, well, we ought to have the same thoughts in the Persian Gulf situation now and try to create that. Let me move ahead to Pope John Paul II and his encyclical Solicitudo Rei Socialis on social concerns, 1988. And he changed the Pope's phrasing, and he says the new name for peace is solidarity, not development, and solidarity. Now that makes sense coming out of his Polish background, the labor union solidarity and sense of community and so on. And I think what he's seeing is that we have to create a communal sense around the world, that we are responsible for one another. And one of I think what flows out of that was his great strictures against the arms race, and this idea that the arms race takes food out of the mouths of people, not directly, not because you buy this weapon you don't have money right now, but it siphons off energy, it siphons off the skills of people into building armaments rather than attending to social problems. I think we can see that in our own country, where we have a Persian Gulf War, and that consumes our interest, consumes our time. It consumed the peace dividend that we were talking about and keeps us from concentrating on our social problems. So you can take that national experience and say that at a global level, all of this interest in arms race, selling armaments, and so on really creates problems. Again, you can relate it to the Persian Gulf. Points out the wisdom of the Pope's teaching, I think, is that here all the Western countries are selling all these armaments to Saddam Hussein, giving him this opportunity to build up this mighty military machine to where they're the fourth largest military power in the world, and therefore we've got trouble in the Middle East as a result. So the Pope's idea is that the East-West get out of the business of selling arms like this and do something more to help people develop socially.
And not only the East-West, but the whole concept that it's almost that old image of there's no standing still. You're either positively, constructively trying to work on building positive, cooperative relationships and solidarity with other nations and with transnational kinds of organizations and institutions, or you're perpetuating a dynamic of tension and of conflict and of competition. I think the sense that if we're not actively doing something wrong, everything's okay, we're beginning to realize that when you have a world that has the major needs that we do, to not actively be doing something evil is not enough, that you have to be positively and constructively working at solutions.
Indeed, and the Pope is calling upon the world community to be creative, I think, in trying to respond to all of that.
think, too, there is an American feel for something that's caught even in that word solidarity. Even in the whole kind of stereotype frontier experience, you got together and raised the barn. Somebody died, the neighbors came in and harvested the crops. We have kind of in our American genetic mix a feel for working cooperatively with other people to solve problems. Haven't figured out how to export it collectively. It seems the minute we move beyond national borders, then the whole competitive thing, the whole national interests issue keeps getting in the way. And yet I think inherently we have an instinct for cooperating with other people to do good things. And we somehow have to find a way to capitalize on that. We have to build on it.
I think one of the important documents, Charlie, in all of this as well, is the bishop's 1983 statement, The Challenge of Peace, American bishops, and which they recognized the responsibility of the United States and the world and wanted us to become sort of leaders in creating a more cooperative spirit and to curb the arms race, to find ways to avoid war, and making really strong statements, as we find throughout all of Catholic social teaching, against war. The modern war, nuclear war, is just unthinkable. It's a catastrophe, and we must find ways to avoid it. Well, we've been talking here about solidarity and the global perspective that the Catholic Church brings to all of this, and the role of the Church to make it all work better, a transnational organization calling upon various nations to figure out how they can live cooperatively. And we've seen that part of that is to say that we must have development. Economic development is crucial. If you want peace, work for justice. And then we see the most recent theme being one of solidarity, as you pointed out, a non-competitive mode in which we try to collaborate, work with one another because we respect the individual cultures in the world, and we recognize if we're going to have peace, we have to work positively at it and not just avoid nuclear war. The Catholic social teaching, I think, gives us a really broad perspective and invites us all to become peacemakers in our own way.